Hey, fourth grade, we are back at it today with Mrs. Frisby and the Rats of NIMH. We'll be reading chapter 7 and 8 today, but to recap yesterday, Mrs. Frisby saw that the cat was kind of weirdly asleep and didn't catch her, but she also saw a group of well-organized rats taking a electrical wire into the rose bush, their house. And she's also going to go ask the wise owl in the woods what to do about her problem with moving day and Jeremy being sick still. All right, chapter 7, The Owl. Jeremy appeared as promised when the last thumbnail of sun winked out over the mountains beyond the meadow. Mrs. Frisby was waiting, her heart pounding in her ears, and 3 of her children were there to watch. Teresa and Martin standing beside their mother, and Cynthia, who was afraid of the crow, just a pair of round eyes peering out around the doorway. Timothy was down below taking a nap and had not been told about the expedition lest he worry and blame himself for the risk his mother must take. Indeed, the words moving day had not been mentioned in his presence. Even the other children, Mrs. Frisby had explained only a part of the problem, that is, that she had not told them that there were only 5 days left, nor anything about Mr. Fitzgibbon and the tractor. She did not want them to worry either. Jeremy landed with a swoosh, a bit dramatically perhaps, and nodded at the children and Mrs. Frisby. "Hello," he said. "Here I am." Mrs. Frisby introduced Martin and Teresa, and Cynthia's eyes. Martin, who wished he was going on the trip himself, asked Jeremy in excitement, "How high can you fly?" "Oh, I don't know exactly," Jeremy said. "A couple of miles, I guess." "Mother, did you hear? You'll be 2 miles up in the air." "Martin, it wouldn't be necessary to go so high on this trip," Jeremy said cheerfully. "No, but I can if you like." "No, thank you. I wouldn't think of your taking the trouble." She was trying hard to hide her terror, and Martin had not helped matters at all. But Jeremy suddenly saw that she was trembling and realized that she must be afraid. "It's all right," he said kindly. "There's nothing to be nervous about. I fly over the woods a dozen times a day." "Yes," thought Mrs. Frisby, "but you're not riding on your back, and you can't fall off." "All right," she said bravely as she could. "I'm ready. Teresa, Martin, take care of Timothy until I come back, and be sure you don't tell him where I've gone." With a small leap, she was on Jeremy's back, lying as flat as she could and holding tight to the glossy feathers between his wings, as a horseback rider grips the horse's mane before a jump. Martin and Teresa waved goodbye, but she did not see them, for she had her face pressed against the feathers and her eyes closed. Here's the picture. Once again, she felt the surge of power as the crow's broad wings beat down against the air. This time it lasted longer for they were going higher than before. Then the beating became gentler as they leveled off, and then, to her alarm, it stopped altogether. What was wrong? The crow must have felt her grow tense, for suddenly from ahead she heard his voice. "An updraft," he said. "We're soaring." There's usually one over this stretch of woods in the evening. A current of warm air rising from the woods was carrying them along. So smooth was the motion that they seemed to stand still, so Mrs. Frisby ventured to open her eyes and lift her head just a trifle. She could not look straight down, that was Jeremy's back, but off to the right and a bit behind them she saw a gray-brown square, the size of a postage stamp. She realized with a gasp that this was the garden patch, and that Martin and Teresa, if they were still there, were too small to be seen. "Look to the left," said Jeremy, who was watching her over his shoulder. She did, and saw what looked like a wide, fearsome snake, blue-green in color, coiling through the woods. "What is that?" she asked in wonder. "You really don't know? It's the river." "Oh," thought Mrs. Frisby, rather ashamed of her ignorance. She had heard of the river, of course, but she had not known what it looked like a snake. She had never been there, since to reach it one had to cross the entire width of the forest. There were advantages to being a bird. In a moment they had left the updraft, and Jeremy's wings resumed pumping. They went higher, and Mrs. Frisby closed her eyes again. When she opened them, the garden patch had vanished far behind them, and Jeremy searched the trees below and began a long, slanting descent. Eventually, as he banked sharply, Mrs. Frisby saw his wing tip a gray-brown patch among a stand of tall green pine trees. From so high it looked like a gnarled green bush. As they circled lower, she could see that it was in fact an enormous tree, leafless, skeletal, and partly dead. One huge branch had recently broken off and fallen, and 3 pine trunks lay bent doubled under its weight. It was a gloomy, primeval spot, deeply shadowed in the gray dusk. Jeremy circled over and one more time, looking at a certain mark 3/4 of the way up the towering main trunk. Just below this spot, another great branch itself, as big as an ordinary tree, jutted out over the tops of the pines, and on this, at last, Jeremy fluttered gently to a rest. They were some 10 feet from the main trunk, and Mrs. Frisby could see, just above the place where the branch joined the tree, a dark round hole as large as a lunch plate. "We're here," Jeremy said in a low voice. "This is where he lives." "Should I get down?" Instinctively, Mrs. Frisby spoke in a whisper. "Yes, we've got to walk closer, but quietly. He doesn't like loud noises." "It's so high." She still clung to the crow's back. "But the limb is broad. You'll be safe enough." And indeed, the limb was almost as wide as the sidewalk. Mrs. Frisby gathered her courage, slithered down, and felt the sharp solid wood under her feet. Still, she could not help but think how far it was to the ground below. "There he is," said Jeremy, staring at the hole. "It's just right there." They inched their way along the limb, Mrs. Frisby gripping the rough bark tightly, being careful not to stumble. And as they came closer, she could dimly perceive the shape of a squat vase sitting back in the hollow of the tree. Near the top of the vase, wide apart, 2 round yellow eyes glowed in the dark. "He can't see us," Jeremy whispered. "It's still too light." Perhaps not, but he could hear, for now a deep round voice, a voice of an organ tone, echoed out in the hollow trunk. "Who is standing outside my house?" Jeremy answered. "Sir, I am a crow. My name is Jeremy, and I have brought a friend. We hope not to disturb you. My friend needs your advice." "I see. And can your friend not speak for himself?" "Sir, my friend is a lady mouse." "A mouse?" A sonorous voice sounded unbelieving. "Why should a crow be a friend to a mouse?" "I was trapped, sir, and she set me free. She saved me from the cat." "That is possible," said the owl, "though unusual. I have heard of such a thing before. We all help one another against the cat." "True. Now, sir, my friend herself is in trouble." "I understand," said the owl, moving closer to the round entrance of the hollow. "Mrs. Mouse, I cannot see you, for the glare of the daylight is still too bright. But if you would step inside my house, I will listen to what you have to say." Mrs. Frisby hesitated. She knew something of the dietary habits of owls, but she did not much like being trapped in his house. Finally she said timidly, "Sir, I would not want to intrude. I can hear you quite well from here. Mrs. Mouse, please understand that I have no interest at all, as a general rule, in helping mice solve their problems. If you have indeed saved a bird from the cat, I will spare you a few minutes. But I do not discuss problems with people I cannot see. Either come inside, or tell your friend to take you home again." Behind her, Mrs. Frisby heard Jeremy whisper very softly, "It's all right. He wouldn't harm you in his own home." She whispered back, "I hope not." She walked up the limb to the hollow, climbed over the sill, and stepped inside. Up so close the owl looked very large. Each of his feathery feet was tipped with 5 gleaming talons an inch long. His beak was curved and sharp and cruel, and he blinked his yellow eyes and said, "Please step across the room, away from the light." Mrs. Frisby did as she was told. As she grew accustomed to the dimness, she looked around her. The chamber in which she had stepped was spacious. At that level, almost half of the huge trunk was hollow and clean, but the floor was extremely rough. It was not really a floor at all, just only the jagged ends of the dead wood sticking up from below, like stalagmites in a cave, so that Mrs. Frisby had to climb rather than walk as she crossed the room. In the back, the walls were narrow in the corner. She saw that the owl had built himself a nest, as big as a water bucket, of twigs and leaves. From the top she could see protruding some wisps of feathers with which he had lined it. When she got near his nest, she stopped and faced the owl, who had turned from the light of the doorway and was peering at her with his great yellow eyes. Jeremy was nowhere to be seen. She could only hope that he was still waiting on the limb outside. "Now," said the owl, "you may state your problem." Chapter 8. Go to the Rats. Mrs. Frisby began nervously, trying to arrange her thoughts. "It's about my youngest son, Timothy. He is sick, too sick to leave his bed, and moving day is only 5 days off." "Wait," said the owl. "Moving from where? Moving to where?" "From the garden patch where we're living to the edge of the pasture by the stream." "Which garden?" It had not occurred to Mrs. Frisby until now that a bird flying freely over miles of countryside would look down on many gardens. "It belongs to Mr. Fitzgibbons." "The one with the large stone?" "Yes, my house is near the stone." "And what makes you so sure moving day will come in 5 days?" Mrs. Frisby told him about the tractor and what Mr. Fitzgibbons had said, 5 days until plowing. "Of course," she added, "it might turn cold again and freeze and even snow." "No," said the owl, sounding quite sure, "it will not. The wild onions are already up in the pastures." He asked her then what kind of house she had and exactly where it was in relation to the big stone. Apparently he knew the spot well. But the more she talked to him, the more Mrs. Frisby became convinced that he would produce no solution to her problem. It had been foolish of her to think he could, foolish of her to come at all, because, she thought, there was really no solution. At last she fell silent, and the owl asked her no more questions. Finally he said, "Lying where it does, your house will inevitably be turned up by the plow and probably broken into bits in the process. There is no feasible way to prevent this. My only advice to you is this. If you stay in the house, you will surely be crushed and killed, all of you. Therefore, it is better to take your chances with moving. Wrap up your son Timothy as warmly as you can. Help him as much as possible on the journey, and hope for warm weather on moving day. That way you are at least sure to save yourself and the other children." The owl paused, turned away from her, and looked out again at the entrance of his hollow. The patch of light it admitted was growing steadily dimmer. "And now, if you excuse me, the night is falling, and I have no more time to spare. I regret that I cannot give you a more satisfactory solution to your problem. Good evening, Mrs." He paused. "I don't believe you told me your name." "Mrs. Frisby." The poor mouse spoke with a sob in her throat, for the owl had said exactly what she feared he would say. There was no real hope for Timothy. The owl had said, in effect, either Timothy alone must die, or they must die together. Even if moving day would be an extraordinarily warm day, the nights were surely to be frosty, and that would be the end of him. Still, one must be polite, and she added sadly, "Thank you, sir, for listening to me." But at the mention of her name, an extraordinary change had come over the owl. He turned back to face her again, and stared at her more intently. Indeed, he gave an agitated flutter of his wings, half flew and half hopped closer to her, bending forward until his great sharp beak was only a few inches from her face. Mrs. Frisby shrank back in fear. What had she done wrong? "Did you say Mrs. Frisby?" "Yes, you asked my name." "Related to Jonathan Frisby?" "Yes, he was my husband. He died last summer. He's Timothy's father. How did you know him?" "That is not important," said the owl, drawing back a little, and looking at her in a new way, almost with difference. "I will say this. His name was not unknown in these woods, and if you are his widow, that puts matters in a different light." Something in a way he said this caused Mrs. Frisby's hopes to lift a little. "What do you mean?" she asked. "I mean, madam, that there is a way that your son's life might just possibly be saved. I did not mention it to you because I saw no way you could conceivably do it, and I did not want to arouse false hope. But if you are Jonathan Frisby's widow, then perhaps it can be done." "I don't understand at all," said Mrs. Frisby. "What is this thing?" "It is not a thing I can do myself. You must go to the rats." "To the rats? But I don't know any rats. They have nothing to do with me." "I don't doubt that. They have little to do with anyone except themselves, and will have less time as this goes on. Nonetheless, I think that they will help you, and if they will, they can." "But what can they do?" "They must move your house to place it where it is safe from the plow." Now Mrs. Frisby's spirits fell again. She said, almost bitterly, "You are joking, sir. You're not serious. No rat could move my house. It is far too heavy, and much too big." "The rats on Mr. Fitzgibbon's farm have ways you know nothing about. They are not like the rest of us. They are not, I think, even like most other rats. They work at night, in secret. Mrs. Frisby, do you know of their main entrance? In the rose bush?" "Yes." "Go there. You will find a sentry guard at the door. His name is Justin. Tell him who you are, and that you have come at my request. Tell him that you want to speak to the rat named Nicodemus. I think they will let you in, though they may insist on swearing you to secrecy. If they should ask, you must, of course, use your own judgment, but my advice would be that you to do as they ask." Mrs. Frisby was close to complete bewilderment. "Secrecy," she said. "Secrecy about what?" "That I cannot reveal. I, too, have agreed to it. Also, there is much I do not know, though I have given advice on certain aspects of their projects." "Well," said Mrs. Frisby, "I don't understand at all, but if it might save Timothy, I will try to do what you have said." "Tell them," added the owl, "that I suggest moving the house into the lee of the stone. Remember that the lee of the stone. Also, do not forget the names, Justin and Nicodemus." "Justin, Nicodemus, the lee of the stone," repeated Mrs. Frisby. "I will remember." She was now so entirely puzzled that she did not think to ask what the phrase meant. Presumably, the rats would know. "And Mrs. Frisby," said the owl, moving again toward the entrance of the hollow, "please understand, I was an admirer of your late husband, though I never met him in person. I wish you well, and I hope your son's life can be saved. You see, I can understand your particular need, for I face a similar problem." "You?" said Mrs. Frisby, "but you have no moving day." "I have lived in this tree, in the same hollow," the Hall said, "for more years than anyone can remember. But now, when the wind blows hard in winter, the rocks the forest, I sit here in the dark, and from deep down in the down near the roots, I hear a new sound. It is the sound of strands of wood creaking in the cold and snapping one by one. The limbs are falling, the tree is old, and it is dying. Yet I cannot bring myself, after so many years, to leave, to find a new home and move into it, perhaps to fight for it. I, too, have grown old. One of these days, one of these years, the tree will fall, and when it does, if I'm still alive, I will fall with it." With that sad prediction, the owl stepped through his doorway, spread his great wings, and was gone, soaring silently downward into the shadowy woods below. Mrs. Frisby followed him out onto the limb. To her relief, Jeremy was still waiting there where she had left him, though he was not very patient. "We must hurry," he said. "It's almost dark, and I'm not supposed to be out so late." Mrs. Frisby, who had the same feeling, climbed on his back, much less afraid now for two reasons. First, she was getting used to air travel, and second, since the woods below them were dark, she could no longer see how far away the ground was. "He talked to you for a long time," said Jeremy as they flew. "Did he tell you anything that will help?" "I don't know," said Mrs. Frisby. Since the owl had brought up the matter of secrecy, it had in fact been secretive himself, she was not sure just how much she should tell Jeremy. "Why don't you know?" "I mean, he told me some things, but I don't know whether they'll help or not." She decided to counter with a question of her own. "What does 'in the lee' mean?" Jeremy, being like all birds' knowledge about the wind, knew the answer to that. "It means the calm side, the side the wind doesn't blow from. When there's a strong wind, you fly up to the barn from the lee, so that you don't get bashed into a wall. My father taught me that." "I see," said Mrs. Frisby, and she became much more puzzled than ever. What did the wind have to do with it? "He told me," she said finally, deciding it could do no harm, "to go see the rats." "The rats?" Jeremy was startled. "But they don't have anything to do with us." "I know, but he said they might help." "What could they do?" "He thought they might move my whole house, but how they could do it I can't imagine." "Oh, I don't doubt they could," said Jeremy. "Everyone knows, at least all the birds know, that the rats can do anything. They're up to something. Nobody is quite sure what. For one thing, they're building themselves a new house, way back in the woods, over the mountains, and they've made quite a big clearing near it. I'll show you. It's too dark now. They used to carry food like the rest of us, but now we see them with other things, pieces of metal and bits of machinery and things I can't even recognize. They take them to the rosebush, and what happens to them I don't know, but the owl knows more than most. I expect he's had some dealings with them. Just the same, I've never heard they're helping anybody but themselves." "Neither have I, but I'm going to ask them anyway. There isn't anyone else to ask." By the time they reached the garden, it had gone almost completely dark, and Jeremy could not linger. "Good night, Jeremy," said Mrs. Frisby, feeling almost affectionate toward the crow. "Thank you for taking me and waiting to bring me back." "You're welcome," said Jeremy. "If you need me again, just ask. After all, if it weren't for you, I wouldn't be here." And he flew off into the darkness, where the last crow to get home that night.